It's so much in wonderful world that brings me back to my neighborhood where I live in Corona, New York.
So said jazz legend Louis Armstrong in 1968 when talking about living in his Queens neighborhood and his hit song, What a Wonderful World. It was his wife Lucille who bought their home in Corona, Queens, New York, while Armstrong was on tour in 1943.
Lucille and I, ever since we married, we've been right there in that block. And everybody keeps their little homes up like we do. And it's just like one big family. I saw 3 generations come up in that block. And they're all with their children, the grandchildren. They come back to see Uncle Satchmo and Aunt Lucille.
The role that Queens has played in fostering and supporting musical talent, and jazz musicians in particular, cannot be overstated. The borough is the birthplace of many music legends. Others were buried here. Sadly, not many of them performed regularly for audiences in this vibrant borough. So why was it that so many music legends chose to live in Queens, but yet Queens never became a rival to Harlem as a destination to listen to jazz? Why is that? And what brought them to the heart of Queens during the last century? Today we have venues in Queens like Terraza 7, the Flushing Town Hall, and the soon-to-be-completed Louis Armstrong Jazz Center, highlighting the best jazz musicians from the borough. So what is the future for jazz in Queens, and in what ways is jazz being appreciated and developed here?
There's no other place in the universe that has had this many jazz artists reside, like Tony Bennett, Louis Armstrong, Dizzy Gillespie, Billie Holiday, Charlie Mingus, Ella Fitzgerald, Tony Bennett, Bix Beiderbecke, John Coltrane, Fats Waller, Count Basie. I can go on and on and on. These are the people that really helped to create the jazz vernacular. And so Queens is very important in that sense.
A lot of jazz musicians were born in Queens, particularly the jazz musician of the Fusion era, like Lenny White, Donald Blackman, Marcus Miller. They were all from Queens. And those guys went on to perform with Miles Davis and Chick Corea and mainstream jazz. So a lot of music from Queens, not just hip-hop alone.
From its inception, jazz has always been a melting pot, an amalgamation of musical influences, and perhaps nowhere was that more evident than in New York City. By 1925, roughly 7.7 million people from a wide cross-section of nationalities, cultures, and ethnicities were living in New York City.
I know from the stories from my grandparents, they came to New York because of Jim Crow in the South. So they couldn't get a job because they were black. So they came to New York to work, and I think a lot of African Americans migrated to New York because of that. And then a lot of them ended up staying, once they got a taste of the city, of the fast life, and the music.
The first time jazz was heard in New York City was arguably in 1917. The original Dixieland Jazz Band, a group of 5 white men from New Orleans, made a guest appearance at Rice & Weber's, a restaurant and nightclub in Columbus Circle in Manhattan. New Yorkers had never heard anything like it.
Original Dixieland Jazz Band became the big name. They had appeared in New York in 1917, early in 1917, and they put out some records that were very popular. Everyone loved jazz at that point.
New York's jazz scene exploded in the 1920s. By then, Harlem was undergoing a renaissance and had become the center of African American culture in the United States. Musicians poured into Harlem from New Orleans, Chicago, Kansas City, and other places from America's South and West, many fleeing racism and seeking a better life. Jazz could be heard everywhere in Harlem, on street corners, in clubs and restaurants, in bookstores, and on neighborhood stoops.
People moved to Harlem to have a better life, moving from the South, moving from different parts of the country. The reason why we had that cultural experience in Harlem at that time, everybody lived together. So you had the artists, you had the politicians, you had intellectuals like Langston Hughes, might live on the same block as Dexter Gordon or Jackie McLean. These were writers, these were judges, and the most brilliant minds in history. But I think just having all of that and the proximity of it, of everybody in the same area, contributed to what happened in Harlem at that time. And it gave you a sense of pride, because you would be walking down the street and you might see Thurgood Marshall. You know, you might see these people that you're reading about or hearing on the radio. You see Jackie Robinson driving down the street in his pink Cadillac.
This was the Jazz Age, or the Roaring Twenties, the first decade to be given a nickname. It was the era of Prohibition, the rise of the automobile, the talkies, women's rights, new sexual norms. A heady time of rapid change not only in popular culture, fashion, and technology, but also in music. And jazz bands were all the rage. Jazz venues abounded in Manhattan. New Yorkers flocked to Midtown to see Paul Whiteman in concert or Benny Goodman at Carnegie Hall.
The other element of that Harlem Renaissance was the music. And Harlem was burgeoning with clubs everywhere. It was like if you had a club that sold liquor and food, you had to have live music. Because if you didn't, people would go elsewhere.
But it was the Cotton Club, Connie's Inn, and other nearby clubs that made Harlem the epicenter of the booming jazz scene in Manhattan.
The Cotton Club was one of many venues that catered to artists of different color, or African-American artists, because the people that came from downtown and different parts wanted to get authentic jazz.
Duke Ellington is known to be one of America's greatest composers. He became the music director, and he made arrangements for all the great floor shows, which would feature Negro women, light-skinned women. From what I understand, they never hired people dark-skinned. And people loved it because it gave them a sense of getting a glimpse of something exotic, sensuous. They called it jungle music, but it had nothing to do with the jungle. It was very sophisticated and elegant melodies and songs. And he stayed there for many years, and many say that his residency at the Cotton Club gave him a chance to experiment with his arranging and compositional style.
But the unfortunate part of that these great artists were revered while they were on the bandstand or while they were on the dance stage, but they couldn't go in the front door, or they couldn't be patrons there themselves. They were just, again, you know, to the level of just being servants.
It's unsurprising that the first modern race riot in America broke out in Harlem. Not long after, the Cotton Club closed its doors. And with the repeal of Prohibition in the early 1930s, Midtown soon replaced Harlem as the heart of swing jazz in Manhattan.
There was a point that things started to disintegrate. And then there was this great era of jazz and music was not the same, was no longer, and Harlem began to become economically underdeveloped. From being a black mecca, as it was at one point, it became a place that was very different. At one point, there was a lot of crime and unemployment. And when you have drugs, unemployment, a lot of undesirable things can happen.
It was during this period of upheaval that many jazz musicians, to escape the high rents and overcrowded neighborhoods of Harlem, began to look beyond Manhattan to establish themselves.
Many people, when they think about jazz in New York, they think about Harlem, and of course that is the case. But so many jazz musicians, Louis Armstrong, Dizzy Gillespie, Ella Fitzgerald, lived in Queens. So Queens is jazz.
Manhattan's jazz history has always eclipsed that of the surrounding boroughs. However, even though jazz venues were few and far between in Queens during the Roaring '20s and the Depression years, many jazz musicians began setting up home in Queens. Among the first to stay in Queens was Bix Beiderbecke.
Bix Beiderbecke was a musical genius, no question about it. Most musicians who played solos and improvised prepared them ahead of time, and they repeated them the same every time that they play. But Bix was famous because every time he played a solo, it was a new one.
When he arrived in New York in the early 1920s, he was part of the Wolverine Orchestra, perhaps the most talked about jazz band in America at the time. Even as a young cornetist, Beiderbecke stood out, but his stellar career would be cut short by alcoholism, and not long after moving to an apartment building on 46th Street in Sunnyside, he died. The time that Bix stayed in Queens was short, but by the 1930s, more and more jazz musicians, many African American, had settled in the borough.
And the reason why a lot of musicians did come to Queens is because we would say it can be traced to a pianist and entrepreneur named Clarence Williams, who was from the Louisiana Bayou.
Clarence Williams convinced a number of jazz musicians to join him in Queens, many of them buying their land directly from him. Soon more jazz musicians followed, and by the 1930s, Southeast Queens had a growing number of residents from New York's jazz scene. Among the first African Americans to settle in neighborhoods like St. Albans and Addisley Park, these jazz stars were, in most cases, met with hostility from local white residents who objected to their presence.
St. Albans was originally created in the late 1800s, early 1900s. All around us was the property of the Hendrickson Farm, where most of Queens and Long Island at that time was primarily farmland and open plains. In the early 1900s, you saw the coming of the real estate boom in Queens and in the outer boroughs of New York City. You had all the farmland being sold off and broken up into blocks and lots and cross streets, and beautiful homes such as this one was erected on these lots.
In the borough of Queens, the homes of the New Yorkers may vary in size, shape, and type of construction. They may be single homes or apartment buildings, but regardless of type, they are much like the homes of people living in the residential suburbs of any other large American city.
Because if you came from the South, if you lived down south, if you lived in New Orleans, Queens gave you a facsimile of feeling, hey, I'm in a rural place.
Also, by the 1930s, massive public works were underway. Parks, highways, bridges that would transform New York City into a city of mass transit.
And these bridges gave musicians who lived in Queens an easy thoroughfare. As a matter of fact, you go across the Triborough Bridge, there was an exit to 125th, right by 2nd Avenue, which then it leads you straight to Harlem, the Apollo where all the clubs were, so it was very easy.
Initially, African American homebuyers were not welcomed in Queens.
It's ironic to think that in the First World War, when the neighborhood was first occupied, that it was a restricted neighborhood. Only white people, only European American people could live here. And there was actually an article in the Times in 1926 condemning this.
Later, in the early 1950s, the Dory Miller buildings in Corona, Queens became New York City's first racially integrated co-op.
The Trumps owned a lot of real estate, and they weren't renting to African Americans and people of color. So what happened was Adam Clayton Powell and some other people got together and created the Dory Miller building that would cater to professional people of color, African Americans, interracial couples, and so on and so forth.
The apartments became home to legendary jazz musicians Cannonball Adderley, Clark Terry, and Jimmy Heath.
And so Queens became a place that was very fashionable for musicians who then were very popular and could afford those homes.
Around the corner, you had Dizzy Gillespie, and then you had Louis Armstrong. You had Milt Jackson and so many other people that lived in this community. So it was like a community. It's like you're not in the city anymore, not quite residential, but not in the city.
Jazz musicians lived and live in Queens because this was the suburbs. at the time, and many jazz musicians were Southern. They came from Southern spaces where you had more space, and they didn't want to live in a small apartment in Manhattan. They wanted room, especially as they were getting more income and had the money to buy space.
Louis Armstrong was the first major jazz star to make a home in Queens.
Louis Armstrong moved to Corona in 1943 after he married Lucille Wilson. They got married while they were on tour, and then they went and continued the tour. And Lucille said, "I'm not sure that this life is for me. I think I need a home."
And I told Louis, I said, let's get a house. Because I was raised in a house, always, you know. I've always lived in the suburbs. So I asked Louis, and he said, what do you want a house for? We'll be traveling. I get a hotel room, and I wasn't about to be cooped up in a hotel room. And so I said, this guy doesn't know what the house is all about. I bought the house myself and didn't tell him. So I had the house 8 months before I told Louis. 8 whole months. So finally I told him 2 weeks before we were to go back to New York, and I told him, I said, Pops, I got something to tell you. I bought a house in a little town called Corona.
Louis wanted to live here because he could have more of a normal life. In Manhattan, he got mobbed. He was a star, he was mobbed. Here, he was mobbed by the kids on the block who wanted to hang out with him. Around the corner from the house, this house, was Dizzy Gillespie's apartment, and they would come and hang out.
Louis Armstrong lived in Queens for 28 years. His property was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1988 and now serves as a museum that presents concerts and educational programs. Both he and fellow jazz legend Dizzy Gillespie are buried in Flushing Cemetery.
Louis Armstrong died in the early morning of July 4th, 1971. The funeral was on July 6th at the Corona Congregational Church, so in this neighborhood. The streets were lined with people who had come to pay honor. It was not the traditional New Orleans style procession in the streets, but it was a somber affair to pay homage to this incredible jazz icon.
Singers Lena Horne, Billie Holiday, and Ella Fitzgerald all later followed Armstrong and set up home in Queens.
All these celebrities here lived here in this neighborhood at the same time. So they would all go to each other's houses, and it became like a celebrity community that was like very tight-knit, and they were living just like working class folks, just like everybody else.
Among them was also pianist, bandleader, composer, and jazz royalty Count Basie.
Count Basie was one of the most famous jazz artists, trumpet players in jazz history. He lived here for many years. Interesting fact about this home is that in those days, it wasn't illegal, meaning it wasn't an actual law that black people or persons of color couldn't live here. But it was a restriction that everybody knew about. And it was just one of those things where real estate people would not sell to black home buyers or persons of color who wanted to buy a home. So in many cases, the way that people secured a house here was pretty much the way that Count Basie did. They would have their agents or their lawyers who were white purchase the house and then transfer the home to them.
Count Basie and others like Lena Horne moved into Addisley Park in the 1940s, and within a decade the area was considered to be one of the most affluent black communities and became known as the African American Gold Coast, a suburban echo of Long Island's upscale North Shore, famed for its mansions and exclusive addresses. Queens became the destination for African American celebrities.
Behind me, here, in this stone house with the blue trim, belonged to one of the biggest superstars that ever lived, and that's Ella Fitzgerald, who lived here during I believe it was the 1950s.
But these legends of jazz did not simply live and die in Queens. It was also a hotbed of creativity. There are records of a key moment in jazz history when the renowned clarinetist and bandleader Benny Goodman, known as the King of Swing, first jammed with pianist Teddy Wilson at a Forest Hills party in the 1930s. The moment was significant as it marked a breakdown of racial barriers, leading to the formation of the Benny Goodman Trio, one of the first racially integrated groups in popular music.
It became, at one point, they called it like a Black Hollywood, because so many musicians as you know, lived there. Fats Waller, Mercer Ellington, Count Basie, Milt Hinton, bass player. And people would ask them, you know, where do you live and how do you like it? We love it.
The scores of jazz makers that settled in Queens formed a tight-knit community. Many were both close neighbors and friends.
Lillian Friedlander. Hello, Gary.
This is Gary.
What do you want to... It sure is. Happy New Year.
And at a time when race tensions were high, the jazz musicians of Queens were living together, collaborating together, creating together. Queens may not enjoy the same status in the history of jazz as New Orleans, Chicago, or Harlem, but it needs to be recognized as one of the key centers of the golden age of jazz.
I used to talk to Nat Hentoff, NEA jazz master Nat Hentoff, who's one of the co-founders of the Village Voice, and he also wrote for the Wall Street Journal. He told me, never again should a book written about jazz history be written that doesn't include the importance of Queens.
Some argue that the jazz landscape, and live jazz venues in particular, has been on the decline since the 1980s. And Queens never had the kind of club scene that took root and proliferated across Harlem and around Broadway or 52nd Street.
Queens is so spread out, so you don't have the same concentration of venues that are producing jazz. It is happening, but it's not as concentrated as you would find it in Manhattan or Brooklyn. No one walks around here. If you come to a concert at Flushing Town Hall or Queens, usually it's because you know who's performing and you're going to make the trek to see that person specifically.
But there are still great places in Queens to enjoy jazz, including clubs like Terraza 7 and other venues like Flushing Town Hall.
Flushing Town Hall itself has been here on Northern Boulevard for 160 years. But our jazz programming actually predates Jazz at Lincoln Center, which most people are not aware of. We've been called the crossroads for jazz in Queens and in New York City, and began our jazz programming here in this building over 40 years ago. So Flushing Town Hall is really committed to not only supporting established jazz artists, but also emerging jazz artists, immigrant musicians who may now be coming to New York City and bringing their rhythms and instruments from all around the world, and then incorporating those sounds and influences into this very initially American art form. And so here at Flushing Town Hall, we have not only created in 2008 our Queens Jazz Orchestra, which is one of our projects. We also present jazz all year long. We have a monthly Louis Armstrong Legacy Jazz Jam. For example, we bring in many, many female jazz artists, immigrant jazz artists, well-known artists who are icons in the field.
I think what Flushing Town Hall has been doing is very, very important with having jam sessions and having a series of musicians come in and perform, giving them an opportunity to perform in front of live people, in front of a live audience.
While Flushing Town Hall has remained a beacon for jazz musicians for decades, a new venue dedicated to jazz performance is currently under construction opposite the Louis Armstrong House Museum in Corona.
So this is the new Louis Armstrong Center, a 14,000 square foot state-of-the-art building. It's going to have a jazz club, cabaret style, intimate space for performances from world-class musicians that are a part of our community.
Queens continues to foster a long tradition of building solidarity amongst talented jazz musicians who both live and perform in the borough. And a vanguard of new artists that are redefining the future of jazz in Queens is calling for even more new venues that they believe could transform their borough into a leading jazz destination.
I think with jazz musicians in Queens, we just need to find more places to play, and we have to get creative. We have to create spaces, you know, we have to collaborate with people. You look at Culture Lab in Long Island City now, and while they're not doing all jazz, they're doing a lot of jazz. They have an outdoor stage. But you have like Chris Kuzmi at Fifth Hammer, who's brewing beer and has a full back line and has jazz there all the time.
There are many bright lights and innovative places that are helping to revitalize the Queens jazz world and bring renewed optimism for lovers of the genre. Joel Pearson and his band The Queens Cartoonists is a jazz group that is pushing new musical boundaries by challenging the tired cliche that jazz music is inaccessible, out of date, and exclusively for the stuffy or elitist. As a live band that plays music synchronized to classic and contemporary animation, this quintet performs jazz against a backdrop of classic and contemporary cartoons.
Magic mirror in my...
From vintage Betty Boop to contemporary Wallace and Gromit.
Oh, wow, look at that, college music students.
For Pearson, reaching a younger audience is paramount.
And a lot of times jazz is felt as like, it's for grown-ups and it's in a basement and it's smoky and everyone's drinking stuff. Well, what I'd like to see in Queens is more venues so that people are coming to Queens to see jazz, and more opportunities for younger people to sort of grow up with the music and be able to interact with the musicians that are already working. Through youth programs or just access to concerts.
Jazz may never be the prominent music genre that it once was in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And Queens may no longer be the stomping ground of jazz legends, but the music of jazz has left an indelible imprint on the neighborhoods of this borough. And one thing is sure. When we speak of America's indigenous music, we cannot talk about jazz history without honoring the keynote played by Queens.